Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this session. This is Bearing the Load, Managing Supply Chain Risk. A couple housekeeping items for today. This session is being recorded, and you will get a copy of this sent to you. Also, we're going to be taking questions, so please ask questions in the chat. And if we don't answer them here, we'll definitely follow up with you. So with that, let's go ahead and get going. Our speakers for today, I want to go ahead and give my colleague Josh an opportunity to introduce himself. So Josh, tell the folks a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Antonio. Good to be on this webinar. So yeah, my name is Josh Davis. I'm a principal technical manager at Fortra, but nowadays I do a lot of different things kind of involved in messaging and go-to-market around, but really using my background as a SOC analyst and having worked in secure operation centers and worked with threat research and so on to kind of communicate that technical message and the great work that professionals are doing day in, day out. But yeah, that's me, Antonio. Remind people who you are.
Sure, Antonio Sanchez, Principal Evangelist here at Fortra. I've held roles in various security organizations. I've done everything from product marketing, product management, technical marketing, run some competitive roles, was a sales engineer at one point, kind of a jack of all trades and a master of none. But anyway, that's enough about me. Let's go ahead and move on because people want to hear about today's topic. So here's a quick agenda. We'll go over the landscape overview as it relates to supply chain risk, go over some of the compliance implications, cover a few of the supply chain vectors, and we'll cover some examples of that as well, and then along with some mitigation strategies. And of course, send in your questions. We'll answer what we can, and if we don't answer it, we'll definitely follow up with you. But first off, the did you know slide. The did you know is 98% of all organizations do business with a third party who has suffered a breach. Now, the 98% comes from a company, a report by the Scientia Institute. Basically, what it's saying is that more than likely you are currently doing business or have done business with somebody who has a breach. If you've been in the security industry for a while, you know that that's probably not a big surprise because it's in our industry, we know it's not if, but rather when. But the idea is that even if somebody does happen to make it your first line of defenses and makes it into the network, if you can still go ahead and find them quickly before they do any kind of significant impact to the organization or to your environment, that's actually still a win. But I mean, the fact is that they still got in. This is why we have to balance prevention along with detection. And of course, our response actions is what we do when somebody gets in. Another report that I read was actually from a company called Sonotypes, and there's been 633% increase in cyber incidents. That's as of for the entire 2023 as well. Again, no, shouldn't be any surprise, particularly as some of the incidents that have happened in the past several months, and we'll kind of go over a few of those as well. But one that I think is interesting is actually the number of suppliers an organization uses, which apparently is 11 third parties. Once you go further out, fourth parties, it actually starts to get exponential. We're talking about the hundreds, in some cases, even some of the thousands. Josh, I mean, I see you nodding your head, so I'm sure you got something to say about that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that I think you mentioned that compromise is inevitable, and we are still spending billions of pounds on security, and it's still the compromise is occurring. But part of that is the complexity of what it is that we're trying to secure, and your stat there with the number of organizations that someone does business with or different vendors they have in their environment. All that introduces new attack surface and risk as well. So I think we've gotten a lot better at addressing our individual attack service, an organizational attack service, let's say, like the endpoints, the network devices, the cloud environment, and so on. But we also have to realize that people we do business with, we are connected in such a way that they can introduce compromise on to us. So that's kind of where we are today. We're talking about supply chain compromise, probably one of the most complicated types of attacks to be successful. But if you can pull it off, it's really successful. So that's why it's so hard for us to stop all attacks, because some of them are really sophisticated. And the definition boils down to introducing compromise upstream. So that that one point there, if we compromise, say, one organization, we're going to use a trusted delivery mechanism, and we'll do some examples later. But this could be an update using an update channel that passes out legitimate updates all the time, but it's got your malicious backdoor in, and ultimately achieves compromise down the supply chain. So you're passing on, you're almost exponentially increasing that initial compromise and multiplying it across loads of others. So this is a big objective, but you can see the payoff is going to be huge. You can turn one compromise into many and then try and monetize that. Or if your goal isn't monetization, sit there quietly and snoop.
Yeah, and the many can easily get into the hundreds and then the thousands and even more than that as you go to your fourth party and even fifth party and so on and so forth, because we are in a hyper connected economy today. So go over a little bit of an example. I mean, we'll use ransomware as an example because that's probably the best known ransomware or a supply chain example. So take us through a little bit about what that would look like.
Yeah, and maybe it's the best known examples because people love to talk about ransomware. So I working in incident response, the thing that still really interests me is attack sequences and the many options that an attacker has within those attack sequences. And they if they fail one of these, they can kind of try again, but with a little bit more knowledge, knowing that they have another option. So to walk to see the green arrows, if we go down those are the basic steps that they need to achieve in order to gain access, install themselves, and move laterally amongst the organization to take enough control of enough pieces to deploy ransomware, if that's the goal. If the goal was supply chain compromise, then you could use those same techniques to get to where they're trying to go, but with the action objective then to pass that on. So they've gone through one attack sequence, let's say, the blue line. They could also then, when they pass it downstream using that trust delivery mechanism, they are going to bypass at least the entry part, and they're straight into entry. They've gained entry using that passing on using the trusted delivery mechanism. So there's less for me to detect and protect and disrupt as a security analyst. You can go very much fly under the radar and get head start on that installation phase where, I might notice that you're starting to pull down malware or using fileless malware, dumping credentials at privilege escalation or whatever. But equally, it might be that the trust delivery mechanism is so powerful that you actually get to that end objective. Imagine if you compromise, remote IT management, endpoint management solutions. We saw that with the Orion compromise, for a really high famous one that I actually got to do a bit of work on at the time. They got straight then to the action's objective basically because they all of a sudden had access to all the machines that were being managed by that remote software. And to your point earlier about it can be thousands, I think that one was thousands, and it was so many that the threat actors couldn't actually realized that most of them never got touched because they didn't have the time to actually get to them. They were focused on the first few ones that they'd found or so on. So hopefully that points to a bit of a paint in using the supply chain ransomware attacks, like an example, but it can be even shorter than this. The point is the compromise that's introduced in the first part then makes it very easy for them to rapidly compromise something else and eliminate some of the steps they might have to take if they were to, say, traditionally compromise you and come at you, through the front door.
Right, absolutely. And actually, I'm just thinking of another example that happened just a few months ago. So here in North America, there was an organization, a SaaS company that supplied software or SaaS software to dealerships, to automobile dealerships, that it basically ran their entire operations, everything from inventory to invoicing, even stuff like service and maintenance and stuff. So the company itself was the one that suffered the ransomware attack. So they got ransomed, and so their systems all got encrypted and everything. So all of their customers, even though the dealerships themselves, they were not they were not encrypted, so their systems weren't encrypted, but because they were so dependent on their software or their SaaS solution to be able to do the daily operations, they were affected, even though the ransom was actually further upstream. Which, if you're the attacker, you want to put as much pressure as possible to be able to achieve the action on objective, which is in this case pay the ransom. They did end up paying the ransom. I think it affected something like I think the number was 15,000 or 17,000 automobile dealerships across North America. So imagine being down for several days because your organization didn't do anything wrong. Your organization, your dealership, wasn't the one that got attacked or got their systems encrypted. It was one of their primary suppliers, one of their partners that did, but it pretty much ran almost the entire operation. So, kind of a fairly high-profile example that happened not too long ago.
that's a good way to stretch the definition as well, because that might not be introducing the compromise downstream, but you're introducing the impact of the compromise downstream onto third
Right.
parties. So yeah, it really makes sense. Is the kind of, if your objective is to keep your business operational, you're starting to see all these different risks that are external to you, and like you said, maybe not your fault. Maybe if you were to turn a
Right.
blind eye to them,
Exactly. Yeah, it wasn't their fault. It just happened. It
but it needs
happened a
to
little
be.
bit further upstream, but
Yeah.
it happened, and I don't know what they could have done different other than go. Well, some had to go back to pen and paper, or even in some cases the little triplicate printers again. Maybe there's a reason why those have to kind of be kept around as well. But that's literally what happened. There was something like $1 billion worth of losses just in
Well,
that
yeah.
particular attack. And also, something else to think about is, there's regulatory requirements. Probably the ones that people are most familiar with is going to be GDPR as well as PCI. I mean, pretty much everything within there has to do with, as an organization, making sure that you're doing what you need to do to be able to prevent any sort of compromise from happening. But also, you're going to get asked about this. I mean, your business partners are going to ask you about your PCI and your compliance and whatnot, or your GDPR. And then the latest one is going to be DORA as well. And so DORA actually is the first piece of legislation that's been out there that actually has a specific call out or a specific pillar as it relates to third party risk management. I know you've been hearing a lot more about that. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So obviously I'm on the other side of the pond to Antonio. So I'm in the Europe, continental Europe, and so I was this one. When this came across, I actually have a background in law before I went to cybersecurity as well. So I often dive into these regulations to see what's changed. And make myself sound very boring, I got a bit excited about this one because it was the first time that they kind of called out two things. One, that the compromise is inevitable. One of the things you said at the top of this call. It's something security professionals have known for ages and have been using it to adopt good security strategies. But it's almost a dirty word, or has been historically a dirty word or phrase to say to maybe executive decision makers. But seeing it kind of reflected in compliance requirements shows that the world is kind of catching up to that maxim and understanding that it's okay to get compromised. What DORA requires is that you have a level of cyber resiliency so that you can come back from that compromise. So resilience not only means withstanding an attack, but also means getting back up and running quickly after an attack. So I think that was great to kind of to enshrine that in legislation. And also it called out specific third parties that need to be brought under your risk assessment. So it focuses on financial institutions, but it also calls out the critical IT providers, and it defines who's critical, and so I won't get into that. But it was saying, hey, if you want to do business with a financial organization, if you're a financial organization, you want to take whatever contract with an IT provider, they need to adhere to these security standards in order for us to be confident they aren't introducing unnecessary risk into your environment, because they are part of your attack surface and they can be part of the reason that you might be impacted. So yeah, that was a cool one for me. PCI is the other one that's kind of we've seen that shift to actually talk about third party risk or supply chain impacts. We're going to do a specific example, so I won't get into too much information then, but they actually call out when it comes to scripts or active items on a web page. You are responsible for anything that executes in that web page, not just the ones that you've written yourself. So we'll show you later how that can introduce compromise.
Right, absolutely. I think one of the interesting things with DORA, sorry, did I cut you off? No? Okay, yeah. I think one of the interesting things I thought about DORA, as well as you were just talking, is that it talks about resilience, and resilience being not just because somebody gets attacked, but also just any sort of outage to begin with. And I mean, we've all kind of remember
True.
the global outage that happened a few months ago at this point. But the idea is to be able to recover from any sort of incident, be it an attack or some sort of an outage, and also a lot of people outside of security now understanding that there's no way to prevent everything from happening. So being more accepting of the fact that, hey, it's a partnership, that all the business units need to work with the security teams and the IT teams, and the lines are very much being blurred. And at the end of the day, we all have to work together to be able to ensure that we can come back from any sort of operational disruption. So we've, a little bit more about the supply chain vectors. Now, this isn't all of them, obviously, because otherwise, I mean, it'd be very small type font. But these are the ones that definitely come up the most often. Email, specifically business email compromise, because BEC accounts for 99% of all reported email threats. If you look at the Verizon DBIR, every year for the past, at the very least, the past 5 years, I mean, email is the top entry vector because the cost to be able to put together an email campaign is so low, and the ability for the bad guys to be able to automate those campaigns are so low nowadays that that's going to be one of the fastest ways to be able to try to make entry within an organization. And of course, one of the things you're trying to protect is data. You talked a little bit about the steps of the kill chain. Data and the exfiltration of data is one of the action on objective. So definitely need to protect that from malicious exposure, but also even from accidental loss as well as oversharing. I mean, how many times have we clicked the reply to all with something sensitive that had a sensitive file or a sensitive document in mail, or you put something in a repository, in a shared public repository somewhere because you needed to just figure out a way to be able to share something with a business partner, something like that, not realizing what you might be doing is actually exposing that sensitive data, sensitive IP to the rest of the world. We can do an entire session just focused on data alone, because at the end of the day, the intellectual property, the contracts, the schematics, the blueprints, the recipes, just everything revolves around data. But there's other things to consider. Web apps, I know that one is one that's near to your heart, so talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I work a lot with the kind of web application firewall team, who manage the rule sets to make sure you can block the attacks at the perimeter, because blocking the web apps is probably the most important place to block, in my opinion. It's you talked about Verizon DBIR, another report that I love. Web applications are the top entry vector using web exploits of the last year, and it's the most touched asset when it comes in a breach. I think it's only 10% of all breaches actually never touch a web application, so mostly they're going to be involved at some point, and that's because they're super exposed. They're the front doors to your organization. People are going to be knocking on that front door, and also then often connected to sensitive data. So the PCI example I'm going to use will look at how that's connected to credit card information, how that can be used to steal it. There's also healthcare information or anything else that might be hosted up there. And yeah, web apps, web app development is rapid. You want to be adding the latest and greatest features. That might involve you grabbing open source software packages. It might involve asking ChatGPT to write one for you, or one of the other LLMs. That could introduce a vulnerability or risk or weakness into your web app build without you realizing. So that's a way the kind of supply chain can compromise it. But also, as we'll look on, when you load in the web page, the modern browser executes so many things on the client side. It's another way to pass on the compromise to the end user. So a lot going on to protect that, your organization, your data, and your users. Vendor access, we touched on some of the examples in the previous one about maybe using remote management software, and that had the power that has, because you've got an IT admin who is remote connecting in legitimately every week to patch Tuesday or whatever it might be. An attacker can exploit that avenue and hide in there. For me as a security analyst, I'm going to find it really difficult to differentiate between a legitimate admin coming in there and an attacker, especially if they do it during working hours, because might at best catch an anomalous log in the middle of the night, but they're normally a bit smarter than that. So that's vendors have a lot of access in your environment sometimes, and that can be exploited, but also it's just very difficult for us to detect because it exists in a baseline of established known good activity. And then SaaS and software is an interesting one, so I'll hand that one back over to you. You got a good angle on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're not talking about just attacks here as they relate to supply chain risk. We're talking about even software glitches. Somebody updated a piece of software that you use, and they sent the update out, and it updated all the systems at the same time, and it caused systems to crash, as we saw that happen over the summer. That's something that hopefully, sometimes you find those in QA testing, but sometimes you can't always test for every single permutation, for every single environment, for every single customer. But stuff like that does happen. So it's not just the attacks that happen. This is just probably, it was probably well-meaning, somebody well-meaning was just doing their job and doing what they were supposed to be doing, and just go ahead and sent out the update that was supposed to happen. and caused a lot of damage and a lot of issue.
Mm.
But going back to vendor access, I mean, vendor, you could actually just split out that category to be much more than access, just the vendor hygiene. What does your business partners, we talked about a little bit, every organization has at least 11 vendors, third party plus, the fourth party. What are they doing? What's kind of the hygiene and best practices do they do? What's their security culture now? So vendor access is really be vendor, because there's a lot more about what they need to do, but also the things that they're going to be asking about you and what you're doing. There's a timely comment that just came in here through this is, I guess, there's a comment, not a question, but somebody says about your web applications. They said, you'll know very quickly how tightly integrated your IT department and your security department on based on how they develop web apps. More than likely, I'm assuming are they talking about security at the end of the cycle, or is
Mm.
security in the middle of it? So that's what I would imagine they're probably talking about. But that's a great thing,
Call,
because
call out
everybody's delivering a web application.
Yeah, call out for DevSecOps there, and making sure
Right.
someone's integrated throughout.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, no, it's
Yes,
a good point.
exactly.
And even the vendor access one, to stretch the definition. I know we said we weren't going to try and do all of them, but like mergers and acquisitions, that's a real use case that I've
Right.
seen, where they acquire a business, but they aren't ready to integrate the networks because there might be risk in there, or even existing compromise in there. So that's another kind of common use case. And I've noticed in the last few years, organizations are a lot stricter with vendors and with business to business. They want to know that you have things in place. That page we had last slide with all the different compliance standards is a great way to show a level of baseline of security stuff that you're doing. But also, I think you need to go a lot further to prove, if you want to, we want to be selected, to do business with these types of organizations. And last one,
Right. Yep.
the SaaS stuff. So I don't think we touched on the SaaS too much, but that's the shared responsibility model, is something that you and I have talked about quite a lot, Antonio. People don't always realize in the cloud they have different responsibilities. Well, there's infrastructure service, platform as a service, and software as a service. And software as a service is probably where the most of the security responsibilities are abstracted away from you by whoever the vendor is. But they can still be compromised too. They aren't infallible, and we've seen single sign-on vendors get compromised. There was a high-profile gang of teenagers named Lapsus Gang that were able to kind of infiltrate there and pass the compromise on to the users of said SSO, and also productivity. Even Microsoft had an issue there with some of their SharePoint pieces where it was able to be compromised from an internal admin account, and they could do lots of stuff with that. So yeah, there's a lot to think about. Not to scare everybody, but there is a lot to think about, not just your own attack surface.
Yep, absolutely. Well, take us through an example here about a website compromise.
Yeah, sure. And this example is an interesting one for two reasons. The first one is that PCI 4.0, which is coming into effect in March 2025, it requires you to have more control over these pieces, and also it shows that there's a lot of different avenues in for the attacker here, and the attack doesn't actually even occur in your environment. It will occur in the end user browser on your end user. So a little bit too much setup maybe, but I'll jump into the explanation. And when you load a web page, what you actually are loading from the web server in your machine, your laptop, is you're getting instructions to load the web page. So those instructions that will provide back, there's inline JavaScript. So there's, if you keep going, so the browser will load these web pages retrieved and execute the scripts to present this to you. Inline JavaScript is stuff that you host on your side and you push directly same channel. There's first party scripts as well, so actually that's hosted in your environment. That's what the gray box represents, but the web page goes out and grabs those separately, so it's not delivered to it straight away. That's the difference between first party and inline. And then finally there's also third party JavaScript, so it's not hosted by you, it's hosted by external organization, but you're grabbing all these pieces and that's going to execute combined together to give that unified single experience of a web page that you and I get whenever we visit a website. We don't realize how many different pieces are executing here. I think the average is over 20 active items generated or executed. So PCI says you need to have control over these, because a threat actor could inject code into your first party scripts. And going back to my attack sequence example, that could be by coming through the front door and going for that all attack sequence, or they could find a way to inject their code, put their code in an open source module, or something you grab off the shelf or off a GitHub repository and put and host in your environment to execute. The other option then, so let's look outside of our organization, the third party. So when you have even less control over, if they can compromise that environment, inject the code into the third-party scripts, then that's passed on to any website that kind of executes those said scripts. And the impact here is the main two ways things are used like that. Attackers use this is for cross-site scripting attacks to do to steal data. So Magecart is probably the most high-profile one, and it's the big example that PCI used because that was about stealing credit card data. And there's been a lot of high-profile breaches around this, including British Airlines is the one that stands out for me because they had one of the biggest fines, compliance fines, because of how much credit card and personal identifiable information was stolen from them. Because whenever someone entered their information on their mobile app, the data was forwarded directly to the attacker, as well as being sent to the airline. And also, you could even drop malware. If you weren't after data stealing, you could just pass on malware like this. So, hey, maybe you're an employee, you work for a really sensitive organization. They're never going to be able to compromise that organization. So they turn to focus their compromises to compromise the individual. And they could find a website that you frequent, use use some social engineering to work out what websites you frequent, maybe find a vulnerable way to compromise that, and then pass that on to the end user. So yeah, hopefully this gets people to think about how big your attack surface is and how much control you need to have to make sure you know, one, what is executing whenever a web browser is loaded, and then two, have controls to only execute the ones that are authorized, and also have a way of validating their integrity, right? They haven't been changed since you last authorized them, or they haven't changed in flight or been modified maliciously or even in error.
Right. And I mean, you need to have ongoing monitoring. That's what's happening. I mean, at the end of the day, one of the reasons that this is constantly within the top 1 to 2 to 3 vectors that's being compromised on the DBI or anything else is because they're public facing. I mean, and again, when you think about the attacker toolkits that are out there nowadays, the ability to just go out and scan the web and look and see, and in many cases it could just be misconfigurations that are happening on the actual website itself that allows them to be able to have that initial access. Once they have access, I mean, they can kind of use that compromised asset for any number of nefarious things. But so a little bit more about third-party software providers, because this is kind of what more people think about when somebody gets compromised.
The classic example.
Take us through that one. The classic, the classic example.
This is the first one I saw, and it's the one. The scale at which you can do is huge. So if you compromise a third-party software vendor, and then we are told every day, well, not every day, but pretty much to update our software, whether that's our mobile phones, our browsers, or whether that's the IT admins doing that on the organizational level. Patching has been important since the 90s and before that for security reasons. But what if that patch contained a backdoor? And that's what this is all about. So compromising a third-party software vendor, you can then steal their certificates to kind of sign your own update, so it bypasses all the controls, and your EDRs and the like think this is legit. It's signed just like it is every month with this update. So that's what I think is really interesting, is you can see that this passes out legitimately, and there's been a real good example this year that never really happened but could have been big, and it was actually in open source software. So if you think of open source software, they're really maintained off the goodwill of an individual or group of individuals who build this, almost a thankless task. Yeah, they get recognition and there are donations you can give, but they SSH was the example. So SSH has been used to remote access into Linux machines, and lots of technology will have support for that without you even realizing. Somebody managed to warm up to the owner of that over a number of years. It would basically, you pretended to be a good friend of theirs, and when they went on a holiday, we took over responsibility to be in charge of maintaining it. And during that time, they crafted a backdoor called the XY backdoor that shipped out in the update to this SSH package, which could have been hugely impactful. It could have hit so many different machines. So many organizations use SSH. Fortunately, someone else noticed that there was a few more milliseconds in their login, some engineer, which I thought was quite amazing. And they investigated and found the backdoor before it really started to have been used maliciously and to kind of propagate their end objectives. So yeah, but that was basically a backdoor, a Trojan, that was pushed out in a legitimate update that we wouldn't have known had it not been for that person, that dev wizard who happened to notice that it was 0.2 more milliseconds per login. I'm glad that person cares about that, because that helped us all.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because that's a scenario where we think about trust, and trust is something that's talked a lot about in our industry. Do you trust your users? Do you trust your employees? Do you trust your executives? Do you trust the vendors you work with? And it's one of those things where for them, everyone's trusted until they're not. And that's a classic example. I mean, these people are working together. They probably thought they had mutual trust built with them. They're out there doing a pretty thankless job out there for, trying to better humanity or better our industry or contribute something meaningful in our industry that they can get some recognition for. They don't always do it for the money. And for whatever reason, at some point, something must have happened in that person's life where all of a sudden he went from being trusted to now untrusted. So maybe there was a more devious plan behind the scenes to be able to allow him to monetize, or who knows what would have happened. But yeah, absolutely, that happens. I mean, it's what it is. It's trust but verify, or trust but continue to monitor for behavior as well. I mean, that's kind of something that most of the leaders, security leaders that I talk to constantly harp on. Is like, yeah, I trust you, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to still remain vigilant with what you do. I trust you to invite you inside my house because you're a friend of mine. That doesn't mean I'm not going to be watching you to see if you're going into the bedrooms or going through my filing cabinets, So trust with some vigilance. But yeah,
Yeah.
0.2, what was it? 0.2 milliseconds? It was that close, huh?
Yeah, and it's a good point you make, because I don't want everyone to go and check if there's been a 0.2 millisecond change in their log. Don't, but I think it's a great example just to show the potential implications that could have been, and the third party risk that you might not realize is a third party risk, because open source, we love to trust it, and it works fantastically for us. And I'm a huge proponent of open source, but every now and then something like this happens. Log4j is another standout example of that open source login module that was introduced in web applications. But yeah, interesting. We almost dived into the psychology of that attacker there, Antonio. That would be a whole webinar in itself.
Right. No kidding. Yeah. So a little bit about, what do you do? What do security leaders do about all these things? And we're fortunate, and we work with customers, we work with partners, we even internally, these are those things that our organization has to think about as well. But when it comes to business email compromise, there's lots of things that organizations do, and the things that you're going to want your business partners, your potential business partners to do as well. And one of the things that actually keeps coming up over the past few months is DMARC, and ensuring that the people that you do business with enforce DMARC, because it's going to be able to prevent spoofing and domain impersonation. When it comes to email hygiene as well, other things have to do with awareness training. Does the organization do something about regular phishing training? Is it your kind of standard check mark stuff, or is it stuff where they're like, hey, these are some of the latest techniques that the bad guys are using these days, or here are the people that are constantly clicking on things they shouldn't be clicking on, and I have to do something extra with those people, but I'm going to only focus on them with something a little more intensive versus making everybody go through it. But the idea of building a culture of security within an organization to be able to help reduce the chances of the business email compromise. We talked already at length about the SaaS and the software, not just the attacks, but also the glitches that happen. You're going to want to know, what's their incident response plan like? Does security team and IT team work together? Because incident response isn't about responding to an attack. Incident response is part of your larger business continuity plan, and business continuity is anything that could produce operational disruption, is what we had with the software glitch that happened over the summer that caused the global outage. Do you have a plan for something like that? That was an example of a corrupted update. But anything up here, stand out to you? I know you want to talk about the thinking about web applications.
Yeah, well, web applications is in my wheelhouse, because I would like to try and protect them and block the attacks, but also make sure that we are monitoring for active attacks on them that might slip through the nets, as part of that kind of defense in depth strategy, because it is such an important asset that it demands it. And, but also those tools, like you talked about DevSecOps before, and tools like DAST and SAST are great ways at testing before it goes live into production to see what's vulnerable. And I can give you some data. I was talking to one of the researchers this last week, who does a lot of work around web shells, so like the backdoors you can insert into a web application. Usually it's done via a file upload attempt or a remote code execution attack, but we see around anything from 1,000 to 50,000 of those a day attempts at a web app. So they are always knocking to try and get those in. So that's why I think having a web application firewall and requiring that anyone you do business with on the web who has a website also has that in place, and all the other the DAS, SaaS, the scanning and the monitoring is important because, like we touched on, it's the most targeted asset and it's one of the most critical. So I think you can tell a lot about someone's security strategy just by looking at the web apps first, because we should prioritize things effectively, and that's a great way to prioritize. You can't be perfect, so start with the most important pieces. The data leakage is an interesting one because when we were talking about this, Antonio, you talked about how it could be somebody, you send data to a third party and they accidentally share it, and that was an interesting example of a supply chain risk that I hadn't really thought about in my context. But how do you kind of go about mitigating that one?
Yeah, I mean, just basically asking the question, ask about their data security program. I've seen a number of instances where they're a set it and forget it. The probably the most common thing that comes up there has to do with DLP, data loss prevention, but it's a very, very broad term. I've seen organizations say, yeah, our DLP program is basically gluing the USB ports such that nobody has access to be able to introduce a thumb drive, and then making sure that we strip anything on email that happens, and that's their data leakage or data loss prevention program there. Obviously, data loss prevention is much larger than that. So if you're going to do business with somebody, you're going to want to ask, tell me about your data security program and hear some of the answers that are out there. And by the way, these are the things that as an organization you're asking. Well, guess what? They're going to be asking the same things from you as well. And the other thing you need to think about it has to do with data oversharing. So you think about, let's say you're a manufacturer of parts or mechanical supplies or something, and you have schematics for one of your partners to be able to design something for you. Well, you want to ensure that design, which may be a patented design, is only being shared by the people that you want them to see, and you have the ability to be able to take ensure that it's only for your eyes only, right? If it's something highly confidential, it's probably different. I was actually, and I mean, I try to keep up with what's happening in the industry and keep up with, looking at articles. But, the number of times people have sent over sensitive files, sensitive documents when there's no sort of inspection in place to be able to say, hey, are you sure you need to do this? I think of an organization, somebody's human resources department that has to share sensitive information about their employees to an insurer. Well, of course, you're going to be probably sharing social security numbers. You're going to be sharing addresses and phone numbers and other kinds of sensitive personal information, but that's a legitimate business case. So do you have a secure way to ensure that information is getting to the insurer? Because while that is sensitive information, that's relevant for the business relationship you have with them, because you need to ensure that you're able to confidently collaborate with whoever that provider is. And then the last thing, vendor assessments, which we'll talk about here in just a little moment. But asking about the security posture of your business partners. They all want to know, what are you doing now? What are you doing different? How did your last pen testing test go? What are your incident response capabilities? When was the last time you did a tabletop exercise? How are you adhering to DORA or to PCI or to any of the number of regulations that are out there? So those are the things that you should be asking, but also just remember that they're going to be, your business partners are likely going to be asking you about that as well. Did I miss anything here, Josh?
No, I think that's good. Yeah, the vendor assessments is the big one. I think we're going to talk a bit more about that now, because you see that all the time. People asking, we from the angle that I come from, that managed detection response XDR side, monitoring the customer's environments, you see a lot of data, and that could be sensitive as well. And you almost, who watches the watchman is that old Latin phrase.
Right. Yep.
So we've always had to demonstrate that we have processes in place to make sure that we are, we do take security seriously ourselves, and then we have controls in place. And it's really interesting to see, and that has been scaled out to almost all the B2B partners now. So I think certifications are still the easiest way to demonstrate that in a glance, at a moment's notice. I'm constantly sending out our compliance pack to prove that, but it can get really intense as well. Like the questionnaires, depending on, you used an example there about a schematic that might be needed to use by a third party to build it. I've done some work recently on kind of state ramp pieces where they want to know, how we've built everything that we are using our security tooling. So we have to have really high documentation of. To use one small example from that is the software, open source software bill of materials. So just so they know what components are part of our overall product, so they can see how maybe that could be exploited individually. So the black box nature of things is really going away, and that people need to know, because they need to be able to evaluate the risk there. Pen testing is probably one you have more experience with. I see the other side of it, my more blue team. But pen test reports, that was requirement of DORA, right? So I think that one's really stepping up as a way to show that you take it seriously.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's actually even in PCI as well, not with 4.0, actually the current version, where they actually put pen test as one of those acceptable ways to be able to demonstrate your recurring efforts along your security posture. So that's become really really popular. Others within that same category, they get wrapped up together, would be like red teaming as well. Ask somebody like if they have a red teaming program, like, oh, okay, they take this pretty seriously. Then if they actually practice red teaming, or adversary simulations is something that gets put in there as well. So yeah, I mean, asking people about this is what you have. This is what we have going on, whether it be internal people or in some cases external. I mean, I've seen on several occasions where people ask as part of the RFIs, what you're delivering as a software solution or as a solution to your customers, do you pen test that? And we contract that out to third-party companies or say, here's our code. Try to reverse engineer it and get into it. And this is part of our ongoing improvement process of ensuring that we're building the best code that we can, building the best products and building the best solutions that we can. So we're not only pen testing ourselves to see how we're doing in our security posture, as organizations should be doing also, but we're also testing the code that we deliver as well as part of the ongoing improvement and part of the Secure by Design pledge that we've signed as well, and we're committed to doing that as well. Talked a little bit about the incident response. Of course, you have to assume something's going to get through. DORA assumes that, that's why they talk about resiliency. PCI have been, much more along that line as well. And just, it's nice to see the non-security community, so the business leaders, being more accepting about the fact that we're not going to be able to stop everything, but if we can stop something before it makes any kind of significant or material impact on the organization, that's still a win. So, people may ask to see about that, and you can ask to see about their stuff also. The patching program, I mean, that's part of your vulnerability management program. How disciplined is your patching program? You can't get to everything. Nobody can get to everything. There's way too many stuff that's out there, and some of the stuff isn't worth, really putting a long effort into, but other things, do you have a commitment? And that's part of some of the new stuff that's coming out with PCI 4.0 as well. Some of it wasn't in the previous version, but it's kind of more direct in 4.0, is your ongoing commitment to be able to patch high-end criticals as part of your patching program. And you already talked about the questionnaires. I mean, SIG is probably the most common. SIG, if you're not familiar with it, stands for Standardized Information Gathering. It's extremely comprehensive. I mean, we're talking hundreds of questions in there, but it's definitely one of them that's been around the longest. But you made the point earlier, if you have certifications around stuff, that'd be the best thing to be able to share, or have your business partner share with you to show your commitment. And I'm sure there's other things that are out there as well, but these are the ones that kind of keep that come up on a pretty regular basis as far as the ability to demonstrate security posture. Anything else you've ever run into as far as demonstrating or customers, partners asking?
Yeah, or maybe just a comment on the kind of, there are levels to these different ones, like what's going to give you more confidence into going to do business with somebody, and this is going to matter based on what the use case is, what's the kind of risk profile of doing business with this person. So you don't need to go overboard, but if it is a really important scenario, for me, I think they kind of go hand in hand, that you need the certifications, the questionnaire you probably can't avoid, but the pen test report kind of shows a future-proof strategy that you have there. That not to say certifications aren't always they have a challenge of having to keep up with the latest trends in cybersecurity, and they take a while to kind of get ironed out and released, so they aren't always on the cutting edge. So there might be examples where yeah, it's not required by your compliance requirements, but actually the best practice would be to do this. And a pen test report kind of exposes that to you. It shows you, hey, you didn't do that. Yeah, it wasn't required, but look how I managed to do. I managed to get into here. I managed to access this data or so on. So it's showing that you are having a future-proof strategy, that you're not just accepting to do the minimum. You want to do as much as you possibly can, and by doing that, by getting intelligent, active, adversary simulation is the best, I think, to do that. So you can prove, hey, everything works. Look, the tensors did it, and we're checking this every 6 months or whatever that period is, so that if things change, if the threats change, if our attack surface changes, if our security configurations drift out too far out of line, that they're not effective, that will be exposed by the pen test report, and you can see if the actions were taken that were recommended, every pen test report, so on. So it proves your kind of commitment to improvement there.
Yeah, absolutely. I've even had some where they've flat out just asked the security leaders to be able to get on the phone with each other. And I mean, that's a very reasonable ask as well, especially if you're going to go into especially if you're maybe newer or startup and you need to demonstrate that you have, enterprise class security as a smaller organization or as a startup organization, because otherwise, especially if you're going into a highly regulated kind of industry, they're going to want to be able to see that. They're going to want to be able to see, before I go into doing business with you, even after all this stuff, I still want to have a conversation with you as well as your leadership, security leadership, before entering into this partnership with you, right? So yeah, and I mean, and I'm sure there's other things that are out there as well, other ways to demonstrate security posture. Let me check and see in here. We've got a little bit of time actually to maybe take a couple questions. Here's a question that's come in here. How often do you update your incident response program? Do you want to take that one, Josh?
Yes, that's an interesting question. You need to the incident response program, as you kind of can cover a lot of different bases here. So yeah, it's hard to give an exact time frame. It depends on your internal resource, what you can do. As often as possible, I would say. At least maybe 6 months intervals, if you can do that, I would suggest, because following checking the incident response plan or having a simulation or playing it out exposes any shortcomings that might exist, whether that's communication breakdowns and so not being here anymore, or so not being aware they're part of the incident response chain and they need to take action. Having to explain to somebody what they need to do and why they need to do it when it really hits the fan is not the best time to do that. And I've been part of that, trying to explain who you are and that you're not the bad guy. You're trying to get them to do something good is actually a really hard conversation to have. But also exposes if you have visibility gaps. So with our XDR and managed detection response solution, we do a lot of proactive visibility reviews to make sure that we have the data we need to apply intelligence, to turn it into telemetry, to catch things earlier. And if we hark back to that attack sequence example we gave with ransomware, that's about having as many controls, as many opportunity to detect that attack before it occurs further downstream. So I think that one, if you can prove you've got a really robust incident response plan, prove it with a pen test as well, couple it together, that is going to be a really powerful piece of evidence that you can show to anybody to demonstrate that trust, that they can have trust in you, that you're doing the right things when it comes to your cybersecurity. Because that's what it boils down to. Whether you're going to business with somebody, whether you're partnering with a security provider, I think this is how can you demonstrate trust, because you can't evaluate everything. So how can they should be confident that they can trust you to do the right thing when it matters?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, everybody's doing their best effort, right? I mean, there's no way to be able to stop everything, but are you taking security seriously as part of, your go-to-market strategy or part of your market strategy as well? Because everybody is just, we're hyper connected. There's enough high-profile incidents that happen on a weekly basis practically. So they want to ensure that they're not going to expose themselves by going into business with you. If we didn't get to your question, we will go ahead and follow up with you offline and get your questions answered. But next steps, if you want to talk to somebody about your supply chain risk strategy, I mean, by all means, we'd love to be able to have a conversation with you. We'd love to be able to see what we can do to help. If you need an assessment or something like that, or we'd love to be able to be a part of that journey with you, because as we know in security, it's all about an ongoing journey. There is no final destination when it comes to security and managing risk, and especially when it comes to supply chain risk, is we're hyper connected and we think about not just third party but fourth party, fifth party, and nth party, which is all of the other all of the other connections that we have with organizations. And with that, that's my last slide. So on behalf of Fortra and on behalf of Josh, my name is Antonio. Thank you all for spending a little bit of time with us. And with that, we're going to go ahead and sign up. Thanks and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me, Antonio.